at the central ideas of some of those works. The first passage that we'll look at here's the first passage. It's from The Genealogy of Morals, and it's a conversation, an imagined conversation between two characters, and you can read it for yourself. But the two characters, what Nietzsche's imagining is two characters who are peering down into a dark workshop where something is being made. He says lies are being fabricated in this workshop. And this is Nietzsche's story of where our modern day Western morality has come from. So this is very different from a lot of other philosophical works, very different from Aristotle, Aquinas, the philosophers who write in a very straightforward, like, here's my question, here are the arguments that I'm giving, the reasons I'm giving for my position, here are some objections, here are my replies to those objections. So very formal, very systematic. Nietzsche is utterly different in style from those philosophers. Much more literary, much more poetic. So a very interesting, engaging style that he writes in. And he's writing 19th century Germany. He is, as is well known, he's an atheist, he's a critic of Christianity. But we'll see in a passage that we look at in a moment that he has a somewhat interesting relationship with the Christian tradition that he's critiquing. So in this passage, he talks about things being turned into things in this dark workshop. So let's see, he starts with weakness is being turned into accomplishment, impotence, which doesn't retaliate, into goodness, timidity into humility, submission or submissiveness into obedience, the inoffensiveness of the weakling and cowardice, the inevitable position of having to wait. These are all given good names like patience and virtue. And then inability to take revenge is being called unwillingness to take revenge, or even forgiveness. So Nietzsche is suggesting that the Christian virtues, peace, peacefulness, patience, kindness, goodness, and so forth, the so-called fruits of the Spirit, that these values, these have been created, manufactured out of weaknesses, qualities that no one would be proud of. Impotence, in whatever sense you interpret the term, no one's proud of impotence. That's not something to be celebrated, but it's that quality. It's being called goodness or mildness, meekness. Nietzsche's he has very much in mind passages like the Beatitudes, which we'll look at in just a second. But I'll let you see the rest of this passage before we move on. Passage on the Genealogy of Morals, and again, you can read it for yourself. But one of the interpretive questions that someone should ask when they're looking at the passage is who's he talking about? Who are these liars? Who are these people who are turning weaknesses into virtues? And a clue is that this line, they tell me that their misery means they are God's chosen and select. After all, people beat the dogs they love best. Well, who is he talking about? Who are God's chosen people? Of course, that's the Jewish people, and the early Christians were the earliest Christians. In any case, were all Jews. So Nietzsche is thinking of this group of Jewish people under the thumb of the Roman Empire, and oppressed people, chafing under the yoke of Rome, wanting a savior, wanting revolution, wanting a restoration of the glory of Israel, and they're very resentful toward their masters, the Romans, and so Nietzsche's suggestion is, what happened is that these people, out of self-pity and out of hatred for their oppressors, they tried to invert the value scheme. So anything that the Romans saw as good about themselves, their strength, their warlike qualities, their courage, all of those things, the Jews, the early Christians, they tried to turn into vices, and by contrast, the qualities that the early Christians were forced to have, their meekness, their standing by the door, their submissiveness, and so forth, those they tried to turn into strengths, into virtues, into things to be praised, fruits of the Spirit again. So on the next slide, we'll look at the Beatitudes for comparison's sake. And Jesus is addressing the crowd and says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," or in the version that it has in this is actually Matthew. This is the Gospel of Matthew, so I've got the wrong title up there. So yeah, in Matthew's version it says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." In Luke's version it says, "Blessed are the poor." So we've at least in that version, Jesus seems to be specifically addressing people who are relatively materially poor, and are unhappy about this. And so what Nietzsche is suggesting about passages like this, and something similar could be said of 1 Corinthians 13, where the qualities of love are celebrated. Nietzsche is saying, in essence, what Jesus and the early Christians are doing is they're inverting the value scheme, and they're taking these things that like poverty, whether material poverty or poverty of spirit, they're taking these things and trying to celebrate them. In essence, make people in a difficult plight feel better about themselves. So blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are the meek, the lowly. They will inherit the earth. One day will inherit the earth. And Nietzsche is in Genealogy of Morals. He's mocking this idea that these early Christians are telling themselves. In the end, we're gonna have a better time, and our oppressors, they're gonna have a worse time. So Nietzsche locates this value scheme in resentment and revenge fantasies that the early Christians have toward their oppressors. And they wouldn't call it that, of course, but Nietzsche thinks that they are self-deceived in doing so. So blessed are the merciful, blessed are the pure, blessed are the peacemakers. Those who make war are Roman oppressors. They're to be condemned. We are the peaceful ones. We are the ones to be celebrated, and so on. So this is Nietzsche's critique of Christian morality. He thinks that it has been invented. It's not something handed down from God. He firmly rejects like divine command theory, the idea that that morality is some objective thing that is binding on all people, and that comes from a really existing God. Nevertheless, Nietzsche does think that there is a very close connection between God and morality. He thinks that God and morality were co-invented; they're invented together in order to prop up a certain self-conception that the Jews and then the Christians needed to have to feel okay about themselves and their plight. So the next passage that we'll look at from Nietzsche addresses his orientation toward that Christian religion and morality that, as he sees it, is on its way out in the 19th century. Science, and it's the famous madman passage. The madman who jumps into the crowd and says, "I'm looking for God, I'm looking for God," and the people mock him, and then he tells them, "We have killed God. God is dead. We have killed God." So this is where the famous phrase from Nietzsche, "God is dead," comes from. Those who often quote the phrase apparently tend not to understand what Nietzsche was saying. So there's the movie, the series of movies "God's Not Dead," which takes its title from Nietzsche, but the makers of the movies seem not to have understood what Nietzsche meant by this idea. And there are the T-shirts you'll see. God is dead, signed Nietzsche, and Nietzsche is dead, signed God. That to suggest that the creators think that Nietzsche is just saying, when he says God is dead, he's saying that God doesn't exist. Now, as a matter of fact, Nietzsche almost certainly did think that God doesn't exist. He was pretty clearly an atheist, but that's not the point of this passage, the God is dead passage. So it's worth looking a little closer at the passage and trying to understand what Nietzsche is getting at here. So he says, "We've killed God. All of us are his murderers." And then he asks, "How did we do this? How did we drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge?" And then if you look at the rest of this passage, the madman seems distressed by the idea that we have killed God. So this is not Nietzsche celebrating the death of God. This is Nietzsche fretting over the death of God, which is very interesting, because in some sense Nietzsche should have been celebrating the death of God if he thought God doesn't actually exist, and that this is in some way liberating to get away from the idea of God. So it would be surprising that he would be fretting over the death of God. So what the death of God for Nietzsche almost certainly means is simply that the idea of God is dying in the West, in Europe, in the 19th century. God was a creation of human beings, and that creation is crumbling in the 19th century as Nietzsche sees it. So it's not a literal death. It's not like Nietzsche thought that God existed and then ceased to exist, nor is he simply saying God doesn't exist. He's saying this idea, which has been fundamental to Western civilization and to Western morality for hundreds of years, this foundation is crumbling. And he's fretting about this because he wonders, where will we go from here? If the West does not any longer base its ideals, its value scheme on God, will we just plunge into nihilism? That is, the idea that there is no value and that nothing matters. Now, it is sometimes said incorrectly that Nietzsche was a nihilist. That is, that Nietzsche believed that nothing matters, that there are no values. And I had professors tell me this when when I was studying as an undergraduate, and that's not correct. That's not Nietzsche's view. Nietzsche does believe in values, but he does not believe they come from God, and rather he thinks that values come from humans. Humans create their values, and that is the only way that values can exist, is by being created. And he challenges people to create values, to be artists, to be craftsmen, and to create something amazing in their values. So I think he sees this as an opportunity, the death of God, for the creation of new and better values. But he is not at all certain that will go well. That Westerners will do what they need to do. So we'll look at one last passage. Consistent with his own principles, Nietzsche cannot tell you which values you ought to create. If he were to tell you, here's the value you ought to create, well, then he would be creating a value for you and telling you to conform yours to that value. So he can't consistently tell you what to create. And so he really gives very little guidance on what values we ought to create. The closest that Nietzsche gets is a thought experiment. And this is the thought experiment. This is the thought experiment of eternal recurrence. So he says, suppose a demon or a spirit, doesn't matter, some spirit that you know to be sufficiently knowledgeable and sufficiently trustworthy to tell you this, that the life that you're living right now, and the life as you have lived it up to this point, you're going to have to live it again. So it's like a reincarnation idea. When you die, your life is just going to restart, but not like Hindu reincarnation, where you could be in a different body and you could have very different circumstances and you might live in a very different way. Nietzsche's idea of eternal recurrence is whatever life you've lived, you're going to live precisely that same life in all its minutest details again and again and again and again, infinitely many times, eternally. And so Nietzsche's question for you, if you were to find this out, that you're going to live this life the way you've been living it, you're going to live it infinitely many times, would you throw yourself down in despair that you're going to have to live like that again and again? Or have you experienced a moment when you would have said, you, to the spirit who tells you this, you're a god and never have I heard anything more divine? Would you be exuberant? Would you be rejoicing that you're going to get to live this life the way you've lived it over and over and over? And so the challenge that Nietzsche is giving us here is the challenge to live in such a way and create values such that if you were to live that way and create those values again and again, infinitely many times, you could rejoice at that thought, that it would be something you would embrace. A phrase that's sometimes used in connection with this idea of eternal recurrence is the gravity or the weightiness of the moments of each moment of your life. Each moment, if this were true, if you're going to live each moment infinitely many times, then each moment has infinite weight to it, has infinite importance, and what you do with each moment comes to have infinite importance. So this is the view of life that Nietzsche is promoting, is asking us to take on. Again, he's not telling us what values to create, but he's telling you how to think about it. He's telling you think about it in terms of eternal recurrence. Who knows whether Nietzsche actually believed that eternal recurrence is true and that we're going to live infinitely many times, but that's how he wanted us to think about our lives. Okay, so those are some central ideas from Nietzsche. There is, of course, a lot more to his philosophy, and I just recommend that you pick up one or two of his books to get more of a taste of what he does and what he's up to. It can be very rewarding. It can be very frustrating. It can be infuriating to read Nietzsche. It's very hard, though, to read Nietzsche and be unmoved in any way. So it's recommended that you just read him for yourself. All right, and that wraps it up for this lecture.